So what is Indigenomics?
Indigenomics is economics from an Indigenous worldview. It speaks to the resilience that we're still here as Indigenous peoples within this country, that we're economic powerhouses, and that really where we're at as a country requires economics as a concept of modern Indigenous economic design.
And how do you come up with a value of $100 billion in 5 years?
The value of $100 billion in 5 years is looking at the existing measurements for the size of the National Indigenous Economic Agenda, and realizing that the 2016 value is at $32 billion, growing from 24, I believe, in 22. Those early measurements are suggesting a rapid escalated growth of the economy. So $100 billion is really the potential of, is that possible within 5 years, and with focused targeted growth as a concept of Indigenomics as modern Indigenous economic design.
And what's your background? I'm assuming you have a background in economics.
My background, I did an international MBA. I've worked in business now for well over 20 years.
And you see...
I also... Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, and you see that there's a lot of untapped growth within the Indigenous community in this country?
Absolutely. The current legal environment has created the conditions for Aboriginal economic growth. Those conditions have been won through legal cases that sets new behaviors, new actions, and new kind of policy shifts, new investment environment to be able to support the growth of the Indigenous economy.
Is there government support for this initiative?
I believe that the concept of Indigenomics is the ability to put out this call or an invitation of who wants to play Indigenomics. When the federal government is able to identify the potential of the $100 billion Indigenous economy, it's an invitation to sit at the economic table, of which the leadership has occurred from within the Indigenous communities, within the nations, and that's really the ability for the federal government to create a response to say, we want to play Indigenomics, we believe $100 billion is possible, and this is the ability to participate in that. An example of that is the Aboriginal procurement environment, and the ability to shift and focus on away from funding models into an investment model of the Indigenous economy.
And how will your Indigenomics Institute help see that this happens?
The Indigenomics Institute is focusing on creating a shift in the media narrative of this country to insert into Canadian consciousness away from this concept of Indigenous peoples are a burden on the fiscal system of this country towards Indigenous peoples are economic powerhouses. So building the story of growing Indigenous influence, the story of growing Indigenous business success, and the requirements for economic inclusion of today. That's one of the activities that the Institute is focusing on, as well as driving a national Indigenous economic research agenda that moves away from deficit thinking, that focuses on kind of the gaps, challenges, and barriers, to move that conversation forward and to be able to focus on constructive, generative research that moves towards the $100 billion, and looking at a economic design framework of how specifically to get to the $100 billion economy in 5 years. So utilizing economic leverage as specific kind of pathways, examples of like clean energy as an emerging market, equity ownership, the capitalization of the Indigenous economy, infrastructure, trade, all of those as examples of pathways to support the development of a $100 billion Indigenous economy.
Well, it'll be interesting to watch and see how this shakes down in the next 5 years. Thanks for joining me, Carol Anne.
Thank you.